You walked away from everything familiar. Not because it was easy, not because you had some perfect plan waiting for you on the other side, a guarantee that things would work out, a safety net stretched underneath you the whole way down. You walked away because staying had quietly become its own kind of danger, slower, less obvious, easier to ignore than the danger of leaving, but real all the same. And one day, the discomfort of staying finally outweighed the fear of the unknown, and you left. What kind of courage is that? It's not the kind people usually picture when they think of bravery. There's no adrenaline in it, no single dramatic moment captured on camera, no crowd watching you do something impressive. Walking away from the familiar is quieter than that. It's the courage to disappoint people who expected you to stay exactly where you were. It's the courage to disappoint the version of yourself who spent years building a life around a plan that no longer fit. It's the courage to admit, out loud or just to yourself, that something you'd invested years into, a relationship, a career, a city, an identity, wasn't actually taking you where you needed to go, no matter how much of yourself you'd already poured into it. That admission is harder than people give it credit for. Because walking away from something familiar doesn't just mean losing the thing itself. It means losing the story you'd built around it. It means admitting that the plan you told everyone about, the life you'd been describing at family dinners and catching up with old friends, the future you'd narrated so many times it started to feel inevitable, none of that was actually true anymore, if it ever fully was. Walking away means rewriting the story in front of everyone who already knew the old version, and that kind of public correction is its own particular kind of exposure. Let's talk about what familiar actually meant before you left it, because familiar isn't the same as good. That's the confusion most people carry for years before they finally understand the difference. Familiar just means known. It means predictable. It means your nervous system has learned exactly what to expect, even if what it's learned to expect is disappointment, or exhaustion, or a version of yourself that's smaller than who you actually are. The human brain is wired to prefer the certainty of a bad situation over the uncertainty of a better one, because uncertainty, biologically, reads as danger, even when the certainty is actually the thing quietly hurting you. That's why so many people stay in relationships that drain them, jobs that bore them into a kind of slow numbness, cities that never felt like home, identities that stopped fitting years before they finally admitted it. Not because those things were serving them, because those things were known, and known felt safer than unknown, even when known was the actual problem. You lived inside that logic for a long time too, probably. You knew, on some level, that something wasn't right. The job that paid the bills but left you hollow by 6 o'clock every evening. The relationship that looked fine from the outside but felt like slowly running out of air on the inside. The city you'd built a whole life in that never once felt like it was actually yours. You knew. But knowing something isn't working and being ready to walk away from it are two completely different states, and the gap between them can stretch on for years, sometimes decades. Because leaving the familiar requires confronting exactly how much time you've already invested in something you're now admitting isn't working. That's the sunk cost trap, and it's brutal precisely because it uses your own effort against you. The more you'd already given to the familiar thing, years, energy, identity, hope, the harder it became to walk away from it, because walking away meant admitting all of that might have been spent on the wrong foundation. It's easier, in the short term, to keep adding to something that isn't working than to stop and reckon with how much has already gone into it. People stay in the wrong relationships for this exact reason. People stay in the wrong careers for this exact reason. The investment itself becomes the argument for staying, even when the investment is precisely what's keeping them stuck. So what finally broke that logic for you? What made the discomfort of staying outweigh the fear of starting over? Usually, it's not one big moment. It's an accumulation. The same way most real change is an accumulation rather than a single cinematic turning point. Maybe it was a string of ordinary days that started to feel identical to each other, a growing sense that you could predict every detail of the next 10 years without any of them changing anything meaningful. Maybe it was a moment of clarity that arrived unexpectedly, watching someone else make a hard change and feeling something close to grief for not having made yours yet. Maybe it was simply exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from performing contentment you don't actually feel, day after day, until performing it became more exhausting than facing the discomfort of admitting it wasn't real. Whatever it was, at some point the scale tipped. The pain of staying became heavier than the fear of leaving, and once that happens, walking away stops being a choice you're debating and starts being something closer to inevitable, even if it takes courage to actually follow through on it. And following through is its own separate battle from deciding to. Plenty of people reach the moment of clarity, the middle of the night realization that something has to change, and then quietly talk themselves out of acting on it by morning. The comfort of the familiar reasserts itself fast, wrapped in reasonable-sounding arguments. It's not that bad, everyone struggles sometimes. This is just what adult life feels like. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe things will get better if I just wait a little longer. Those arguments aren't entirely wrong, which is exactly what makes them so effective at keeping people stuck. There's always a version of staying that sounds reasonable. There's always a story you can tell yourself about why now isn't quite the right time. You had to get past that story eventually, and getting past it required something specific. You had to stop waiting for the leaving to feel easy, comfortable, or fully justified before you did it. Courage isn't the absence of fear or doubt. It's acting while the fear and doubt are still fully present, still whispering all their reasonable-sounding objections, and doing the thing anyway because some part of you had finally become more certain of the cost of staying than the cost of leaving. Let's talk about what you actually lost in the process, because pretending the walk away was painless would be dishonest, and this isn't about pretending. You lost the comfort of routine. Even a routine that wasn't serving you had the strange comfort of requiring no new decisions, no new adjustments, no new uncertainty about what tomorrow would look like. You lost some relationships along the way too, probably. People who were fine with the old version of your life and didn't know what to do with the new one. People who'd built their own sense of stability partly around your predictability and felt threatened when that predictability disappeared. You lost the identity you'd spent years constructing, the one built around the job title, the relationship status, the city you called home, and had to sit in the uncomfortable blankness of not quite knowing who you were without those familiar markers attached to your name. That blankness is one of the hardest parts nobody warns you about. When you walk away from something that's been defining your life for years, there's usually a gap afterward, a stretch of time where you don't yet know what's replacing the old identity, and the not knowing feels almost worse than the discomfort you left behind. At least the old, uncomfortable identity had shape. The new, uncertain space doesn't have shape yet. It's just open, undefined, waiting for you to build something new inside it, and building something new is slower and less satisfying than people expect, especially in the beginning, when the only evidence you have that the decision was right is a vague internal sense of relief mixed with an equally vague sense of terror about what comes next. You sat with that terror. You didn't rush to fill it with a new relationship, a new job, a new identity assembled quickly enough to make the discomfort go away faster. Or maybe you did rush a little, the way most people do, before eventually learning to slow down and actually let the space exist for a while before deciding what belonged in it. Either way, you got through the blankness, which is more than a lot of people manage. Most people who reach the moment of clarity never actually leave. They stay in the familiar thing, quietly resentful, quietly aware that something else was possible, and spend years explaining to themselves why staying was actually the wiser choice. You didn't stay. That distinction between the people who know something isn't working and the people who actually do something about it is where the real courage lives. There's a particular kind of grief in walking away from the familiar that deserves its own space, separate from any grief over what specifically you left. It's the grief of leaving behind who you were while you were there, even the parts of that version of you that you're glad to be done with. You can hate a chapter of your life and still miss the person you were reading it, still feel a strange nostalgia for a self you've outgrown, still catch yourself missing the specific texture of days you wouldn't actually choose to go back to if given the option. That contradiction is normal. Walking away doesn't erase the complexity of what you're leaving. It just means you decided the complexity wasn't reason enough to stay. Here's something worth acknowledging honestly. Not every walk away from the familiar is courageous. Sometimes leaving is just running, an attempt to escape discomfort without doing the internal work required to make sure the next chapter doesn't repeat the same pattern in a new setting. The difference between courageous leaving and reactive running usually comes down to whether you did the harder internal work first, whether you actually understood why the familiar things stopped serving you, or whether you're just changing the scenery while carrying the exact same unresolved patterns into whatever comes next. If you'd done that work, even imperfectly, even without fully realizing you were doing it, then what you did wasn't running. It was leaving with clarity, which is a fundamentally different act even if it looks identical from the outside. You did the work. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not on any timeline you'd have chosen in advance, but you did it. Enough to know the leaving wasn't just an escape from discomfort, but an actual, considered decision about what your life was supposed to look like going forward. That's what separates courage from panic. Panic runs from something. Courage walks toward something, even when what it's walking toward is still mostly undefined. There's something else worth naming about the specific moment right before you finally left, because it rarely looks the way people expect. It's not usually a moment of triumphant certainty, some internal fanfare confirming you're making the right call. More often it's smaller and stranger than that, a strange calm settling in alongside the fear, a sense of I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't keep doing this, that arrives quietly, almost matter-of-factly, after however many months or years of building up to it. That calm doesn't erase the fear, it just sits next to it, and somehow that's enough to finally move. People sometimes assume that courage requires the fear to disappear first, that you're supposed to feel ready, confident, sure of the outcome before you act. That's backward. If you'd waited to feel ready, you'd probably still be exactly where you started, because feeling fully ready to walk away from something familiar rarely happens before the walking away. Readiness, in situations like this, usually gets built retroactively by doing the hard thing while still scared and discovering afterward that you survived it, which is the only kind of evidence that actually convinces the nervous system anything. You can't think your way into readiness. You mostly have to act your way there, uncomfortably, one uncertain step behind schedule. Let's also talk honestly about the specific fear of disappointing people, because for a lot of people, that fear is the real obstacle, bigger even than the fear of the unknown itself. Walking away from something familiar often means walking away from a version of yourself that other people had grown attached to, the reliable one, the stable one, the one who always stayed the course no matter what. When you change direction, you're not just changing your own life. You're forcing everyone who knew the old version of you to update their understanding, and some people resist that update fiercely because it's inconvenient, because it disrupts the roles they'd assigned you, because your predictability was doing something for them that they don't want to lose. You had to get comfortable with disappointing some of those people. Not out of disregard for them, but out of a recognition that their comfort with your predictability was never actually your responsibility to maintain. Some relationships survive the shift just fine, adjusting to the new version of you without much friction. Others don't survive it, and that loss is real, worth grieving honestly instead of minimizing. But staying familiar and stable for the sake of other people's comfort with the old version of you was never a good enough reason to stay stuck in a life that had already told you. In 100 quiet ways, it wasn't working anymore. It's worth mentioning, too, the specific loneliness that comes with walking away from the familiar, especially early on. For a while you're standing in a strange in-between place, no longer fully part of the old life, not yet fully settled into the new one. People who are still living inside the familiar thing you left can't quite relate to what you're going through because they haven't done it themselves. People who've already fully rebuilt their lives on the other side of a similar leap sometimes forget how disorienting the early stretch actually felt, and their advice, however well-meant, can land as impatient or oversimplified. You end up somewhere in between, mostly alone with the specific texture of your own transition, which nobody else is quite living through in exactly the same way you are. That loneliness doesn't last forever, but it's real while it's happening, and it deserves to be named honestly instead of glossed over in the retelling. The version of this story that gets told afterward, once the new life is settled and thriving, tends to skip over the middle, the nights you questioned whether you'd made a mistake, the moments you almost turned back, the specific ache of missing something you know, logically you were right to leave. Leaving out that part makes the story cleaner, more inspiring, easier to package into something motivational. But it also makes it less true and less useful to anyone else standing where you used to stand, wondering if the fear ever actually goes away or if you just learn to move through it anyway. It mostly doesn't go away entirely. You learn to move through it anyway. Sometimes look at what you did and call it reckless, impulsive, hard to understand. They'll ask why you'd give up something so stable, so known, so hard-won, for something so uncertain. What they usually don't say out loud, and maybe don't even realize themselves, is that watching you leave forces them to confront the same question you eventually had to confront. whether the familiar thing in their own life is actually serving them, or whether they've just gotten used to calling it stability because leaving felt too frightening to seriously consider. That's not your responsibility to manage. Their discomfort with your decision doesn't make the decision wrong. You know, better than anyone watching from the outside, exactly what staying was costing you, and exactly why the unfamiliar, uncertain, undefined life you walked into was still the better choice, even without any guarantees attached to it. You walked away from everything familiar, not recklessly, not without cost, but deliberately, with your eyes open, understanding fully what you were giving up, and choosing to give it up anyway, because some part of you had finally become brave enough to trust the unknown more than you trusted a familiar life that had already told you, clearly, it wasn't going to become what you needed it to be. That's the courage, not the absence of fear, the willingness to walk forward with it anyway. Somewhere down the line, the unfamiliar life you walked into starts to feel familiar too, quietly, without you noticing exactly when the shift happened. The new routine becomes just routine. The uncertain identity becomes simply who you are now, no longer requiring conscious effort to inhabit. That's the strange thing about courage like this. It doesn't stay dramatic forever. It eventually just becomes your life, ordinary and settled in its own new way. Until one day you realize you can't quite remember what it felt like to be that scared, standing at the edge of everything familiar, deciding whether you were brave enough to walk away from it. You were. That's the only proof that ever mattered, and you already have it, carried quietly, permanently, in the simple fact that you're standing somewhere new right now, instead of still standing exactly where you used to be.